It's quite an honor and a privilege to be here this morning. I don't take it for granted that indeed, even though I'm one of the organizers, I have to make this presentation to all of us. And as you see in the title, I thought it will inspire all of us. It was intentionally to provoke some thinking around ideas that are running in the country now on multilingual education broadly. It's a special privilege, Prof. Perimal, to serve under your leadership. No doubt that your vision for the school is in the realm of making this whole world a better place. I mean, educationally speaking, because education is key to human life and sustainable development. I always say to people, well, my name is Leketi Makalela, and as you can see, Gamasinga. Pangeskali drooling. I hold a spear and I pass. That's what it means. Proud to be a member of the School of Education. I thought the keynote really is about sharing with members of the school about the amount of work that the School of Education is doing and the impact that we have at the national level. You should know that South Africa has taken a stance today as the first country in the world to adopt trans-languaging or the use of more than one language for learning and teaching as a national strategy. And because of that, in 2025, all things being equal, they're supposed to roll out from grade 4 going forward. That's the best School of Education that carried out this impactful work that had twisted or shifted the Department of Basic Education to do that. We are also in the Best School of Education proud that we are actually running national multilingual pedagogies for all universities in South Africa. In other words, they see Best School of Education as the leader in anchoring multilingual education broadly in the country. And thirdly, Best School of Education, again, as you know, Best University has got a language policy that says isiZulu, Sesotho, South African Sign Language and English are official languages of the university. But we have been very walking slowly in terms of implementation. It is my also pleasure to share with you that it is the Best School of Education, again, that is tasked with implementing the Best Language Policy with multilingual pedagogies being run from faculty to faculty. And in the next few weeks, you'll see that the lunch hours are going to be very, very busy with what is called learning an African language during lunch throughout the university. And that, again, that's why we're proud to be members of this school. So, in what I'm going to share with you today, let me see, I hope I can say this that later. Okay. So we talk about mother tongue-based bilingual education as a clarion call for South Africa, in fact for the big part of the world, to follow suit. Bilingual education, which means using more than one language, in this case for learning and teaching, for the pedagogy. And there are implications for basically all courses, all the work that we've been doing as teacher educators broadly, but I thought methodology courses in particular are the easiest with regard to implementation. So this is what I'll share with you. So in Spedi, we say home is which is a very deep ideologic expression. It means the cow gave birth in the dungeon, in the thick of in the mountains, and therefore it refuses the head boys taking away what is called after birth. That is like a pleasurable thing that the head boy is supposed to get, and therefore it simply means there is a challenge. So it is the South African story of our life. I'm sure you have heard about Days of Our Lives. David Alexander, that's to start, that's what he's saying. It is an amazing fact that South Africa, in spite of its modernist pretensions, is one of the few countries worldwide where at least primary school children are not taught through the medium of the mother tongue or a language of immediate community. Underline that, language of immediate community, that is the familiar language. It is an equally amazing fact that within the South African context, the only children who receive mother tongue education virtually from cradle to tertiary level are minority English and Afrikaans speaking children of the country. Children born to parents whose home language is one or other African language. That is, the vast majority of our children are doomed to be taught through the medium of second language. Mostly English from the third or fourth year of schooling, mostly by teachers for whom this medium is at best a second language, but often only a third language. That was way in 2001. I have a friend from Norway, the name is Prof. She says, what is the African problem? She says you can summarize that in one sentence. And that problem is that African children do not understand what the teachers are saying. And equally, the teachers don't fully understand what they're saying. So if you add not understanding plus not understanding, and that is referred to as stupefaction. It's not education, but stupefaction. That's what you see. And as you know, my colleagues, that South Africa and many other African countries have adopted a missionary education language policy that says 3 years of education in your home language and you sing or swim in grade 4. Unprecedented. In fact, it's not something that you can benchmark with any country in the world, just as in the African continent. And from the 1800s, that's why the pretensions of 11 official languages, now 12 with the sign language. Molaotheto wa Malemo Thuto, the language and education policy of 1997, is very explicit and clear, subject to any law dealing with language in education and the constitutional rights of learners. In determining the language policy of the school, the governing body must stipulate how the school will promote multilingualism through using more than one language of learning and teaching. Very clear, in no uncertain terms. But how do we interpret this? Of course, from a vertical type of multilingualism. In other words, even though in our universities we say we have got multilingual, we have multilingual policies, and I'll show later that we interpret it from what I call the wrong angle. Because of this, we had this inspirational book that says our institutional identity of multilingual students in post-apartheid South Africa. So what we see, the book in general says that we have linguistic apartheid in our higher education institutions. And because of that, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to implement our language policies in the manner that we had conceived of them. Linguistic apartheid means that languages do not like each other, they must not be together, they must be treated as separated, hermetically sealed units in boxes. No relationship whatsoever. That's so unnatural. because of that, Finance Dove and I said that we need to decolonize multilingualism because it's such a fancy concept. Everybody says multilingualism, your sound to be relevant, right? It's cozy. We are a multilingual country, we are a multilingual university, but indeed what we mean by that is multiple monolingualisms. I had the privilege to be in New York, and I had the privilege to be in Johannesburg. Johannesburg being the largest city on the African continent, a potpourri of languages. You can find every language from the continent and outside of the continent here in Johannesburg. City of New York is the biggest city on this little rock called planet Earth. You have every language the city. But there is a difference, and the difference is this. When you're in New York, you hear an Icelandic person speaking Icelandic to another Icelandic speaker. You hear an Arabic person speaking Arabic to another Arabic person. You hear a Spanish person speaking Spanish to another Spanish person. So what you have is what you call vertical multilingualism. But let's walk outside of our campus, just outside of this building, or go to the small street in the city of Johannesburg. You know what, England, the thing that you're talking about, I need food because it's not a good idea. So you see languages leaking into each other, right? A Zulu speaker speaking to another person who speaks in a different language. So you have flattened type of multilingual engagements, and that's what we call horizontal multilingualism. Now, the challenge is in our interpretation of multilingualism, we take the New York version and we want to plant it in Johannesburg with the mistaken belief that it will work. It will never work because it's disconnected to the material reality in which the speakers in that context do. So when we say multilingualism, we say which multilingualism. Here today in this world, we also say, well, if governments fail to implement multilingual education, at least the affordances of technology, we are saved if we can leverage on technological affordances that we have today. And it's because of this that we don't believe that we have 11 or 12 official languages, because the interpretation of this is what is actually making it impractical and impossible. And I should add, we mean in the meaning-making process. You don't really have 11. Here what we have adopted is societal multilingualism and not individual multilingualism. It doesn't take into account the number of languages that I, as a person, the speaker, actually use and communicate fluently. And then as I move into our presentation, I'm going to take you through some of the pointers to say we do this because we become historically unconscious. Okay? And there was a British historian in 1963 who said perhaps in the future there will be some African history, but at present there's none. Then there's only the history of Europeans in Africa. Even our multilingual interpretation is not really local. People without history and culture become mimics who have placed their memories, and very important, that's a good word, psychic tomb, dead psychologically. We have to meet prevailing global challenges from within our own worldview, our own multilingualism, in other words, and proceed to action from our own authentic possibilities based on the culture and competencies of Africans themselves. Here we are speaking to local ways of knowing, of being, and acting. And I love acting here because we're going to talk about methodologies. And here is just my demonstration of New York versus Johannesburg type of multilinguality. That's the story that I was sharing, just showing this visually. We should agree, I think it's well known, colleagues, that there are two big elephants in initial teacher education, or let me say higher education broadly. Despite not having enough classes or not having enough anything, multilingual students are marginalized and castigated as failures. In other words, our curriculum from basic education has been designed with a monolingual student in mind. That's why then we can easily say their epistemic access, which means their pathway, how they come to know, is compromised. And that's why we say the nature of who they are, or their identity positions, or ways of being, are questioned. In other words, levels of confidence is questioned because you think there's something wrong with you, when in fact there's something wrong with the curriculum and not you, but the problem is pushed to you as if you're the problem. Because the students that we produce are not, there's no modeling or induction into multilingual pedagogies. In other words, preparing them to serve these multilingual schools that we need them to function. How do we know this? We have what is called the method effect, that we are getting weaker over time, and this story started in the primary schools. We carry this with us, and then we have our student teachers that we produce that going to have to do the work, but from wounded. If you're epistemic, your pathway of knowing is compromised, you're wounded, even if you have the degree. Eventually, you're not that type of a didactically thinking, innovative teacher that should do something different out there. And how do we know this? We know that from high school the train goes down. And how do we know that? We know that our throughput rate is very, very low. In other words, between 50-25% throughput rate, that is universally, nationally, rather than, it's not university, this is universities combined. In other words, the number of students who complete their degrees on record time, if you have a 4-year degree, finishing 4 years, very, very low. But why? We know that the use of one language is not a mistake. It was designed to be like that. What we have today is a hangover from that initial ancient design. In the interest of time, I'll just skip through this, but the need to transition the local people to Western cultural values necessitated an adoption of European monolingual practices from missionary schools. That's what I said earlier on. And why are we here? Because why do we have a one language kind of oriented curriculum? Because we believe that more than one language will create mental confusion or chaos in our classrooms. And number two, we also think that multilingualism means multiple monolingualism, and we refer to as monolingual multilingualism. Bear with me for the tautology or the oxymoron. But even further, once upon a time, there was a European history of anxiety and enlightenment, where they had a world vision of territorialized national languages. That's what we call nation statism, where it was believed that one language, one nation, one language, one nation, because that will create peace and unity and all the ideals that Europeans had at the time. Of course it did work. That's why Graham Bell was able to produce or invent his wife, Margaret Hello, what we call the bell, the phone. Because relatively one language, one nation worked at that time, but it was that time. That's how we dragged it and made it a thing for everybody else, even in contexts where it doesn't materially work. So in the Department of Education, this story became well known that actually we are working on the wrong footing. Then there was a win of what we call the National Rapid Assessment Study, which we worked with, and the Department of Education, as you know, the Act 12 of 2012 says all public institutions, entities, and national government departments must have a language policy, and they must have language units. That says at least 3 languages that you should have. But in particular, the Department of Basic Education wanted to ensure that African languages are advanced to the level of usage as languages of learning and teaching beyond grade 3. In order to move away from the 1800s, and in 2025, there is that possibility. I'm just sharing with you how it happened. So the language policy or planning development or framework was used that says you must have the status planning, the state of the language, you must have a corpus, develop words, vocabulary for these languages, acquisition planning, which is where the methodology comes into picture, as well as prestige, which is advocacy. How did that work? There's a type of research called effectiveness implementational hybrid design. It simply means you fix the plane while it is in the air, or what's called feasibility studies. You evaluate effectiveness while implementing in order to scale. And that involved a study of researching with, not just on the participants, what we call rapid environmental scan that involved each of the 9 provinces of South Africa. The focus was on assessing optimal conditions of language and education policy implementation and the gaps between the policy aspirations and actual practice. This is the type of research that changed, as you say, the basic education's view on what needed to happen. As you can see from the participants, it involved people who don't personally talk to, and also in their languages, not English research about African languages. Traditional leaders, faith-based leaders, counselors, parents, school governing bodies, teachers, learners, principals, and the unions, all involved in all the 9 provinces. And there was, you must have heard colleagues about the Eastern Cape study, so that involved, I remember when I was in this, okay, let me pass on to this. The case, was it a prototype? There were a lot of shadows of doubt around what the Eastern Cape study or pilot that went for 10 years since 2010. Would that be a prototype? Is it reliable that can be rolled out nationally? This involved detailed investigation, which meant included lesson observations as well. Here are some of the key findings. Going to be a bit quick. Well, the first one says desirability to learn through African languages beyond grade 3 there is a big desire. It says that transition to English in grade 4 is premature and very disruptive. Teachers and everybody else are doing that. And the teachers, all of them say code switching is the only way to teach. There's no way. If in an English class, you have to code switch, which means there's already an informal practice of using more than one language in the schools, but the problem is that it's not acknowledged or is done surreptitiously. And we found that the number of schools are piloting with straight for English medium, which was a mistaken piloting, because there's a focus on English proficiency and not necessarily on learning. Well, English barrier to learning, yet there are myths that overstate the importance of English as a language of learning and teaching. And one of those myths, as you know it, English is a language of work. English is a language of international anything, right? So it became clear also in that while English is the language of international communication, right, there is a distinction. It's not necessarily a language of international language of learning and teaching. Everybody in the world, they learn through their own languages, but they learn English as a subject. So our parents and everybody were confused about that reality, that English is not necessarily an international language of learning and teaching. Stereotypes that underrate the value of African languages when they are not developed, they don't have vocabulary, and you find that to be far from the truth. Every language has got the possibility, but it develops in the process of use. For example, English itself, words we have in science, in math, are not necessarily English. Photosynthesis is not English, right? Virus is not English. In fact, all the scientific concepts we have in there are not necessarily English, are borrowings from other languages. So therefore, to say that an African language does not have when English has, it can take from English. And in fact, that we hear teachers say, if photosynthesis, and there's nothing materially wrong with that, because that's a borrowed word, it's a concept. Okay. It's because of this recommendation that there must be mother tongue-based bilingual education, at least for 7 years of schooling. But I'll take you to this one, what you call the bull's eye. What is that one thing that you can do that can create the biggest impact with so little effort? It's called the low-hanging fruit. Then the biggest recommendation is to normalize translanguaging as a pedagogy. Why? Because it's already happening. But not as a pedagogy, it was happening organically. But now you can make it a pedagogy, make it a method of learning and teaching. And that's why next year, South Africa has taken this route. And in fact, it's the first country in the world that has taken in its national policies to put translanguaging as a strategic educational pedagogy. Because of the challenges that we have spoken about, I want to spend just a few minutes. I'll make sure that we leave the last 5 minutes for question and answer, but I'm going to rush. So we move from fixity to fluidity. And it comes down to the question of translanguaging. What is this translanguaging? Because everybody is talking about translanguaging. And it's a concept that has been infiltrated by misunderstanding, and because of that, again, is one of the concepts that would lose its value. So we can define this by saying, well, it is not. What is not? We know for sure that it is not translation. And it is not interpreting. It is also not code switching. It's also not code mixing or code meshing. But we do speak about a repertoire, which means it is a language, this is internal to the speaker and not external. Because one of the challenges in multilingual implementation is, what if we have a classroom that has got 50 languages? The minute you say there is a problem, it means you misinterpret what translanguaging is. Because you think as a lecturer, that is your burden, to have the languages that you're going to use. If we agree that it is internal to the speaker, then it doesn't matter how many languages are in the classroom. Okay? So if I say, you know what, Excel, into ikhulumayo, I get right, because it's bad. Right? So what you have heard me say, you have had a number of languages. Indeed, from your point of view as the hearer, is code switching, because I was switching from one language to the other. But it is your problem as the hearer. That's not necessarily what I was doing as the speaker, right? So code switching is external to the speaker, but translanguaging is internal. What I was doing, I was simply making sense. I was communicating, and I wasn't thinking, oh, by the way, let me switch to Afrikaans. Now let me pause and go to isiZulu. Now let me cut and speak. I was not thinking language is in the way that you're hearing me. And how do we know that? There was a meaning continuum. What I said in the first language that you have heard was not cut because I cut languages. The meaning was carried on until to the point. In other words, it had the beginning, the middle, and the end, irrespective of the many languages that you have heard. Right? So translanguaging focuses on meaning making, not what the languages look or sound like. If that is the definition, then we don't have a problem with the many languages that you hear out there. Also, it's not the lecturer's issues, internal to the student. Okay? Because of that, we also know that there's no cost or anything that will support lecturers at universities. So we are initiating a short course on translanguaging, which will take for 10 weeks or 10 units, just to debunk and get it closer so that we are confident and comfortable on our. But I'll grant to, how do you know this? Is it again another colonial West Germanic concept that comes into being? We can say boldly no. Sankofa is a Ghanaian mythical bird that is, you go back to fetch. As a methodology, if you go back to fetch, then you find that once upon a time, again, there was a wealthy multilingual city in Southern Africa. So what you hear students doing in your classroom is reincarnation of their ancient selves. It's not a confusion, in other words. And it was in this mountain of Mapungwe, with the cousins in the Limpopo Valley, right? The Zimba Zamaju who had created, built houses of stone, what you call Zimbabwe. And because of this, we can theorize from our own competencies and say we can therefore have Ubuntu translanguaging, where we say there's confluence and infinite relations of dependencies between languages, where we can say there's no one language that is complete without the other. For multilingual students, in the process, I underline of meaning making, as you see, is the confluence of the Sasha and the Limpopo rivers in this space, reflecting what is happening in the mental horizon of a multilingual speaker. The question: why is the initial teacher education still a monolingual establishment? Can we really justify that? So we have normalized the abnormal. So what is abnormal had been normalized. For example, one of those things that is really an amazing fact is you can be in Africa, graduate in law or any degree without having learned an African language. Where else on earth does this happen? That's an abnormality. So what will change look like? Let me go quickly. If you say I need a trans-languaging focused or orientated curriculum, people who are in curriculum studies, tell us if trans-languaging or using another language will affect the curriculum drastically. Well, in terms of progression, I don't think so. You still have got your topics going in the order that they go. You won't sway them otherwise. In terms of pacing, well, maybe to slow down because now you're allowing other languages but we can hurry slowly. Right? Maybe it will quicken things because understanding is enhanced. What we are sure about is that the depth would be engaged, would be improved, and the breadth is not affected at all. In short, if you have a multilingual curriculum design framework, you have nothing to lose, but the students have a lot to gain. Let's go to what we call a multilingual lesson. In our methodology, we say we have got the starter, the main course, and the dessert. That's how I think of a lesson. When you plan a lesson, you say there's the beginning, like life, there's the middle, and there's the end. Okay? So what you do in the initial part of the lesson is called language activation. Now, if you are trans-language or multilingual oriented, you say, here I'm going to do language activation in the pre-lesson. What you do, two things. You activate prior knowledge. What is it that they know about the topic before you actually teach today? And that can be done very easily, allowing students to trans-language, not the lecturers to trans-language. As you said, it is an individual work. Okay? If students can talk to each other in other languages, that's a bonus. It's a cherry on top. First and foremost, it is individual to the students. They think in the language that you know. Right? And sometimes you don't need to share with us, but you can share if and as necessary. And then the scaffold say, what are the most difficult concepts without which students will understand my lesson? You plug them in, you say, in different languages, what you mean. If you talk photosynthesis, you know that green doesn't exist in isiZulu, for example. Okay? That's a color. And then it gives students a mental linguistic awareness, because it's a great candidate for what you call abstract thinking. Actually, it's a good thing. What you call metacognition, thinking about your thinking, and you can only get to that space if you have got more than one node. Okay, one is, of course, is looking back with a prior knowledge, but scaffolding is looking forward, and that can be done in more than one language. You're not losing anything in teaching onomatopoeia, Cindy. During the lesson, now is language integration. Well, this is probably the more where you need to do a little bit of more planning. But again, you harness multilingual competencies. You know, when you come to this topic, you can pause and say these 2 minutes. If you're going to do this and say, well, you don't have text in other language and it's immaterial, because students can access the text that is in one language multilingually. But these are the avenues. Suppose you, all things being equal, you can have text available in different languages, but you don't have that for now. And it doesn't mean that you need to wait until you have isiZulu texts being made available. But this is what you have, the I and the we of the Ubuntu, okay, transversal, multilingual mini lessons. I think in our classroom we always say, well, now you sit in pairs. You are pairing students. Then you can be very strategic about this. The first one is called individual translingual mapping, right? Where as an individual, think in your own language and on a piece of paper, annotate or produce it in a different language from the language of input. That's an individual way, that's translanguaging. Or, then from there you can say, I'm going to look for cognate languages. In other words, languages that are related to any good language, people see that corner. All sorts of languages see that corner. If there's somebody speaking Icelandic, it's okay for you to stay at your own corner. But if there's another West Germanic language, let's say French, not French, but English or Finnish or any, you can be in that group. So you begin to see that languages are actually in families. And also it's intentional on the part of the lecturer to say, now I want you to see if somebody speaks a different language from the language you have access to. Why would you do that? Because they have English as the medium. In your own language, what you say, what you do, what happens, what does that mean? All of these are pedagogical, multilingual innovations that are possible. We call language integration. We haven't lost anything. Let's look at this one. I'm going to wrap up, but let me show you this. What is called low-stakes multilingual writing, actually written into the curriculum. We say writing is thinking. And then when we teach, you always ask our students, do you understand? They say yes because they're so polite. So why do you keep asking that question when you know the answer? They can respond to that in a low-stake way in writing, where you say, write quick summary of what you think you have learned in a different language from English. Or the response in a language different from the language of English. The other one is called, what is one thing that you have learned which you can do 1 minute? This is the post-lesson stuff we're talking about. With this in mind, I want to say that, and I love this one, we go to the moon and let us go. We go to the moon not because it is easy, but we go to the moon because it's desirable to do so. If we believe that multilingual education enhance and support students' learning and not our teaching, then that's the place we need to go. Thank you, Program Director.